Hello Revolution students, and welcome back to another video on VCE History Revolutions. In this video I am going to review the 2022 end of year exam. The end of year exam changed last year with the new study design, and it changed in the sense that the way it was organised, or the number of sections and the number of questions that were included, changed slightly. So in previous years, the exam still had two sections, a section A and a section B. However, in those two sections, there were two parts each, which made 4 parts in total. And each part was worth the same number of marks, which was 20 marks. And each part, you used to devote 30 minutes to writing for each part, giving you a total of 80 marks and 2 hours writing time. 30 minutes plus 30 minutes plus 30 minutes plus 30 minutes. However, with our new examination format, it has changed slightly. So we still have a section A and a section B. However, section A has 2 parts, one set of questions on your first revolution, whichever one that may be, that you studied, and the other set of questions on the second revolution that you studied. Source analysis questions. And then section B, there are essay questions about the 4 revolutions that can be studied in the course. So America, France, Russia, and China. And the great thing now about the new exam format is you can actually choose the essay question you wish to answer. So for the purposes of this video, in section A, we're going to be looking at the source analysis questions for the Russian Revolution and the source analysis questions for the Chinese Revolution. And then in section B, we can have a look at the essay question on the Russian Revolution and the essay question on the Chinese Revolution. But what is really, really good is if there is a difficult essay question in section B on the Russian Revolution, then you can choose to do the essay question on the Chinese Revolution instead. So let us just have a look at the timing. And that is the big question for doing the exam. So like the previous exam, you still get 15 minutes reading time. And imagine you're walking into your examination hall, you sit down at your designated seat and table, and in front of you is, as I've got on the screen here, our question and answer book and our sources book. You are not allowed to do any writing during the reading time, but you can open up both of these booklets and read through the questions and look at the sources. And these sources will be a mix of images, primary sources, written extracts, as well as probably historical interpretations as well. And all the questions will relate to those in section A. So in your 15 minutes reading time, you are using that time to read through the question and answer book. And I emphasize again, look at the sources book. You are not looking out the window and going, oh, that's nice. Wonder what's going on out there. Look at the sunshine twinkling and look at the clouds floating in the sky. And you are not either thinking about what you did last night. You may have looked at some awesome anime. Or something along those lines. You are reading furiously and preparing yourself to write. So I have set out the exam with the question and answer book on this side here and the sources book here, and that's the way we'll look at it. So once you've read through the question and answer book and the sources book, the 15 minutes have passed, and now you have to get on to actually writing. And the question in the front of your mind is, well, how much time should I spend writing section A? And how much time should I spend writing section B? You've got 2 hours writing time. A rough estimate is that for every mark on the exam, you should spend about 1.7 minutes. So for example, in section B, which is the essay, it is worth 20 marks, okay? So if you times 20 by 1.7, you'll end up with about 34 minutes. If you think back to the previous exams, you used to have 30 minutes. Now you got around 34 minutes, and it's just approximately around 34 minutes. For section A, and the first lot of questions on your revolution number 1, whatever that may be, for us it's going to be the Russian Revolution, that'll be worth 25 marks. So we will then spend around 42 minutes, 42 and a half minutes, okay, for the source analysis questions just on our first revolution. On our second revolution, the source analysis questions on our second revolution in section A, it is also worth 25 marks, which means that we spend also 42 and a half minutes, approximately. So if you add 42 and a half minutes for your Russian Revolution source analysis questions in section A, your first revolution, and then for your second lot of source analysis questions in section A, which are going to be the Chinese Revolution source analysis questions for us, which is another 42 and a half minutes, plus then your essay in section B, which you're going to spend around 34 minutes, that adds up to approximately 2 hours there, okay? Give or take. So that's what you're aiming for. Once we get into it and we start having a look at the actual, the source analysis questions themselves, if we're breaking it down, we'll see there's 2-mark questions in there. They're the easy ones. You spend about 3.5 minutes on those. For your 3-mark questions, around 5 minutes. For your 5-mark questions, and there's a couple of those in there, about 8.5 minutes. For your 6-mark questions, around 10. And then for your 9 or your 8 or 9 questions, mark questions, the big ones where you have to use your own knowledge plus the various sources or a couple of sources perhaps from the source book as well, that's around 15 minutes. Okay, so that's your time guide for setting out how much you should devote to each of these parts of the exam. All right, enough about talking about time. Let's have a look at some of these questions now. So I've got my 2 exam booklets side by side, and I'm going to flick between both as I go through. So let's first open up our question and answer booklet, and let's go to the Russian section. So I'm going through here, and I can see I'm not doing the American Revolution, so I don't need to do or look at pages 4 to 7. I'm not doing the French Revolution. I've only studied the Russian Revolution and the Chinese Revolution, so they're the sections in the exam that I do. And I'm going to start with the Russian Revolution and go right down to page 12. So let's flick through. Flicking through, and I'm up to the Russian Revolution there. So I've got a question A, question B, question C here. The first question is a 2-marker, which is an identifier. The second question is a 3-marker, and the C question here is a 9-marker. These can be in any order whatsoever, really, if they wish to put it. The 9-mark question doesn't need to be here. It could be at the end of this section on the Russian Revolution, analysing sources, but they've put it in the middle here. So you answer the questions as they are presented in the booklet. You can see here, the examiners have given you a certain number of lines. Your answers, and this is a really good guide, all right? The length of your answers should fit within these lines, okay? You shouldn't be doing, and if you're looking here on question A, for example, you've got a couple of sentences. You shouldn't be writing, for example, in question A, 150 words, because you're wasting your time. You're not going to get any more marks than the 2 marks here. Use that extra time to write an awesome response to this 9-mark question down here for question C. All right, so anyway, so I've got these questions here. Let us go to our sources book on this side and get to the corresponding sources. So let us have a look. So going through, I'm not doing the American Revolution. I'm not doing the French Revolution. All right, here's the Russian Revolution. So source 9 here, I've got source 9 on this side, which is a historian's interpretation of the significance of Bloody Sunday, published in 1976. Sablinsky, The Road to Bloody Sunday. And here is the corresponding question over here. So the question's asking, using source 9, identify 2 consequences of Bloody Sunday. So there might be a number of consequences of Bloody Sunday referred to in this source. I only need 2. I can start my response here by just stating 2 consequences of Bloody Sunday, according to source 9, are. So let's have a look. The day of resurrection had turned into a day of destruction, and for most workers, they no longer had a czar. The people who only a short time ago were willing to rest all their hopes on the goodwill of their sovereign were now willing to take up arms against him. So here is one point here. Okay, that's one consequence of Bloody Sunday. They're prepared to take up arms against the Tsar now. What generations of revolutionaries had not been able to achieve in years of propaganda and agitation was brought home to the working masses in a few hours by the bullets of His Majesty's elite troops. Here is another consequence of Bloody Sunday. The Tsar was held personally responsible for the tragedy in front of the palace, and all Russian society was repulsed by the brutal suppression of the peaceful demonstrations. So the 2 consequences, the people were prepared to rise up against the Tsar, and the Tsar was also held responsible for the massacre, the Bloody Sunday massacre. Now, what you need to do is, the important thing here is that you quote directly from this source. So you include that quote up in your response here in question A, and then you include this quote here, and include the ellipses. You don't need this second lot of ellipses here, don't worry about that. But certainly this sentence here, the Tsar was held personally responsible for the tragedy in front of his palace. So they're the 2 consequences. You directly quote from the source. If it's an image, then you refer to specific features of the image. All right, let's move on. So I'd get the 2 marks there. Now, for question B, describe 3 visual features of source 10 that show that popular movements had achieved a great victory. Okay, so I'm looking at source 9 here, so I need to go on to source 10. So I'll just go over to the next page. Eventually. There we are. All right, source 10. So here we have the poster below titled Memorial of the People's Victory. Nikolai Romanov hands over the crown to his conquerors was published in Russia in early 1917. The palace in the background was the headquarters of the Duma and then of the Petrograd Soviet of Workers and Soldiers Deputies. So the examiners have been very nice to the students here, and they've given already some explanations of what some of the key features in this image are. So the palace there, okay, that is the headquarters of the Duma and the Petrograd Petrograd Soviet of Workers and Soldiers Deputies. It's the Tauridi Palace, I believe. You can see here Nicholas, the Tsar, kneeling and presenting his crown to the Russian people. We've got source details here, okay? It's important to understand sometimes you'll need to refer to the date when a source is created, and particularly with images such as this. Sometimes they'll have the date of when the image was created, and we can see here we've been given it up here, published in early 1917, and we've got the publication date in here. Sometimes, however, images such as these can be taken from a compendium of Russian revolutionary propaganda, for example, and in the source details here, not only will the date of when the source itself, this image, was created, be included, but also the publication details and the publication date of when the compendium itself was produced. So the compendium may have been produced in 2010, but the source itself, the image, was created in 1917. So just be aware of that. Don't get confused. Don't say, for example, that this image was created in 2010 if it says down here, because it was not. All right. So, describe 3 visual features of Source 10 that show that popular movements had achieved a great victory. So, with images such as this, there's a lot going on. There's always a lot going on. What you should try to do is to refer to, in this instance, the 3 most significant features. Okay? The 3 most significant features. So, firstly, you have to talk about the Tsar kneeling, and you specifically refer to the Tsar kneeling, okay? And then you can talk about these revolutionaries here, this soldier and this worker here holding these flags. Memorial of the people's victory that says up there, Nikolai Romanov hands over the crown to his conquerors. I would say that's what is referred to down here. Now, you can see we have translations down here, or captions. You can use those translations in your response. Sometimes, and if you're doing the Russian Revolution and the Chinese Revolution, you will have sometimes either Russian script or words that may not be translated in an image, or if you're doing, for example, a Chinese image of the Chinese Revolution, you can have words in Mandarin, which may not be translated. If they're not translated, then the examiners do not expect you to comment on them. If they are translated, though, either up in, up here, for example, in the description up here or down below, then yes, please use them. And the examiners, believe that you should use them if you wish to. All right, so describe 3 visual features of Source 10 that show that popular movements had achieved a great victory. Okay, so we start. And I would just start with something along the lines of the 3 visual features of Source 10 that show that popular movements achieved a great victory are 1. The Tsar kneeling, handing over his crown, or the Tsar kneeling in the foreground of the image, handing over his crown to the revolutionaries. The revolutionaries themselves, you can refer to the soldier holding one flag and then the worker holding the other flag. Both key players in the revolution. If we think back to we're talking about in early 1917, so this is the February Revolution. Both played a key role in the revolution, the February Revolution, and the demonstrations in St. Petersburg at the time. Other things you could talk about the Tahiti Palace as well, and this reference to the Petrograd Soviet of Workers and Soldiers Deputies, and the Duma. And the Duma deputies played obviously a very key role in the February Revolution as well, when they created the Provisional Committee and so forth, and then the Petrograd Soviet organised the workers too. So there's a lot of stuff here. Okay, let's go on to question C now. And question C is the 9-mark question. And I remind you that you should be spending about 15 minutes on this. It's worth 9 marks. It is the highest marking question you're going to get in this section on the sources. After this, we'll see there's some 5-mark questions. So they're important as well, but this one's the big one. This is the differentiator. And you need to read it very carefully, because these 9-mark questions are going to ask you to do a number of things. So evaluate the extent to which the leadership of Tsar Nicholas II contributed to the outbreak of the February Revolution. Use evidence to support your response. So if we look at that question, some of the key things it's asking you to do. Firstly, it's asking you to evaluate, to make a judgment. Did he play an important role, a very significant role? Or was Tsar Nicholas's role minimal? Was it other factors such as, for example, World War I? Or you could argue the Tsarina, or you could argue creepy Rasputin, that were the most significant factors in the February Revolution. Whatever you're going to argue, you need to make an evaluation, you need to make a very clear judgment, and you can do that in your contention which you begin your response with at the start of the question here. So you could write, for example, that the leadership of Tsar Nicholas II was the most significant factor to the outbreak of the February Revolution, because it was he, for example, who nominated himself as Commander-in-Chief, appointed himself Commander-in-Chief of the military on the 22nd of August 1915, and left the Tsarina and Rasputin in control of the civilian government in St. Petersburg from this time onwards up to, except for the Allocation, up to the February Revolution itself. So something along those lines, but you want to have a very clear contention at the start of your response and have your evaluation in there. Okay, let us keep going. So once you have done that, then we have this part here, and it says you have to use evidence to support your response. So evidence is evidence from your own knowledge. So this includes discussions of key policies, inclusion of key quotes from the Tsar or the Tsarina or Rasputin. You could talk about ministerial leapfrogging, for example. You could talk about various other factors. You can also, and you should, in your 9-mark question, include historical interpretations about, in this instance, the leadership of Tsar Nicholas II, and there are lots of historical interpretations about the Tsar's role in the February 1917 revolution. So you have those in there, and the third source of evidence that you could use for your response to this question would also be, or you could also use the sources in your source booklet, okay? And if you're going to use those, then refer specifically to them, but not too much. I would say use 1, maybe 2 at most. You want to include as much of your own knowledge in here as you can. And the other thing you want to make sure that you do is that you don't include the same information, or you try to avoid as much as possible including the same information from a previous response of yours in another response. So if you've made a point in question B, try to avoid making the same point in question C. What you're trying to, particularly in question C, show the examiners is your own knowledge, okay? So the more evidence from your own knowledge, the better. And some other points that you could include in this response here, I mean, we've already spoken about the Tsar appointing himself as Commander-in-Chief of the military in August 1915. You could also refer to, and we've spoken about the role of Tsarina and Rasputin, but you could also talk about, for example, how the Tsar treated the Duma and the growing anger from the Duma towards the Tsar and the way he was running the war or leading the war effort against the Germans and the Austrians. Lots you can write in question C. So you can see here for question C, you've got all these lines here, and then you've got all these lines here as well. So there's a lot that you can write here. And if you're written all through here and you still want to write more, and you've only spent 14 minutes, for example, on writing your response to question C, then you can always just put an asterisk here or little note. Make sure you write within these boundaries here. Do not write out here because it may get missed in the scan. And when the scan gets sent to the examiners to correct your work, they might not be able to see what you've written out here. So you don't write. You have to write within the borders. But if you've written to here, and you still want to write more, you want to write another paragraph or something, you can put a little note down here, see end of the exam booklet, something along those lines, and then you can go to the end of the exam writing booklet, and there's actually in this booklet here, and there's actually space for you to write more. Actually, if we go through, let's go through very, very quickly. Let's have a look, go through here, and there should be some more, there we are, extra spaces for responses, okay? So you could just put here, Russian Revolution, question section A, question C, continued, and then you write the rest of your response here. Okay? And the same for any other questions as well, any responses if you don't have enough space in the exam paper itself to write your answer. All right, now, so we've looked at question C. Let's go on to question D. Using source 11 in your own knowledge, explain why Lenin decided to dissolve the Constituent Assembly. So we go over here, we go to source 11, and what we have here is, it is a speech from Lenin. So on the 6th of January 1918, Lenin announced the dissolution of the Constituent Assembly in his speech to the Central Executive Committee of the All-Russian Congress of Soviets. So this is a primary source. It is a speech from Lenin. You even have the date here. So lots of information to work with here. Let's have a look at the question. So the question is asking you to, using source 11 and your own knowledge. Okay, so you're using source 11 and your own knowledge. So you're doing two things here. You're probably aiming, going back to question C, I should have mentioned this. In question C, you're aiming for around 250 words. Some of you might be able to write up to 300 words for question C, those 9-point questions. For question D, you should be aiming for around 125, 150 words, which means you have your contention, you have a point or two about source 11, and this source is a written extract. So in your points about source 11, you have to quote directly from the extract, include that quote in your response, and then at least 1 or 2 points from your own knowledge, ideally a couple of points from your own knowledge about why Lenin decided to dissolve the Constituent Assembly. Okay? There's lots of information you can include here. Why Lenin decided to dissolve the Constituent Assembly on the 6th of January 1918. Firstly, you'd want to highlight in your response that the Constituent Assembly began sitting only on the 5th of January 1918, and it lasted for 1 day. Okay? And it was dissolved by Lenin because, and why did he dissolve it? Well, firstly, one point you could talk about was, in his mind, there was already a democratic government in Russia in the form of the Petrograd Soviet, and he argued and believed that the Petrograd Soviet and the Soviets were the purest form of democracy. So you could have a point about that. You could also refer to the fact that the Bolsheviks came second in the elections to the Constituent Assembly, and the majority party in the Constituent Assembly was the Socialist Revolutionaries. So they actually had most of the votes. Well, they were the majority party, so they were more powerful in the Constituent Assembly than the Bolsheviks, and obviously Lenin didn't want that, so that was another reason why he decided to dissolve the Constituent Assembly. The other problem Lenin had with the Constituent Assembly, as you would know, is that he saw it as a bourgeois democratic institution and containing all the corrupt capitalist elements that the revolution had tried to rid Russia of. So there's a number of points you can include here. You should try to include 2. You start with a contention. Using source 11 and your own knowledge, explain why Lenin decided to dissolve the Constituent Assembly. And your contention could be something along the lines of, Lenin decided to dissolve the Constituent Assembly because, and then you could include those 2 points or a main point that I'd spoken about before, because Lenin believed, for example, that the Petrograd Soviet was already a democratic institution, democratic government, didn't need another one, didn't need a Constituent Assembly. And then make sure that you refer to using source 11, etc. In your response. So at one time we considered the Constituent Assembly to be better than Tsarism and the Republic of Kerensky. But as the Soviets emerged, they being revolutionary organisations of the whole people, naturally became incomparably superior to any parliament in the world. So there's your point there. You can include that quote straight there. According to Lenin, the Soviets were, or they became, superior to any parliament in the world. You make sure you cite source 11, so you could say something along the lines of, according to source 11, you be specific, according to source 11, Lenin wrote that the Soviets were, start the open quotation marks, superior to any parliament in the world, closed quotation marks. And then after that, you can include your own knowledge in your response here. All right, let us now go on to the next question. And it is a 6-mark question. So a 6-mark question, should spend around 10 minutes on it. And you should try to write, once again, around 150 words for this. You can keep writing down here if you need to, if you've got big handwriting. And once again, you can go to the back of the source booklet if you wish, if you need to write any more. So using source 12 and your own knowledge, analyse 2 effects of the new economic policy. Now, just say you're reading through question E here, using source 12 and your own knowledge, analyse 2 effects of the economic policy. Well, you've got source 12, so that's easy. So you can get a quote from here. But say, for example, you suddenly freeze and you forget all your own knowledge about the new economic policy. What is it? Well, the first thing to do is don't give up. Don't give up. What you do is have a think. If you can't think of anything, leave it and go on to another question, and then come back to this later in the exam. When you're writing your other questions, you might, for example, go on to the, or do in section B, the essay on the Russian Revolution. And when you're writing that, that might jog your memory, and you may be able to remember some points about the new economic policy. If that happens, then you can come back to this question and answer it, okay? But don't spend 10 minutes just staring at this question and trying to figure out what's happening, when you should be using that time writing answers to the other questions that you do know. That being the case, the new economic policy is actually, there's a lot you can write about the new economic policy. This is asking you to analyse 2 effects of the new economic policy, and then using source 12 as well. So let's have a look what source 12 says. The new economic policy succeeded in reviving the country's economy. By the mid-1920s, agriculture and industry had recovered to their pre-war levels, but the NEP system was deeply unpopular among party members and workers. They resented the capitalists known as Nepmen, who became rich operating small factories and shops. Party members asked why they had shed blood during the Revolution and Civil War, only to see the capitalists return and exploit workers once again. The revolution was supposed to eliminate the social problems of the Tsarist era, but instead these problems persisted. So there's a number of quotes you could include in your response here. Obviously, a big focus of this source is the Nepmen. So you'd start your response with a contention. 2 effects of the economic policy, or the 2 effects of the new economic policy, were the creation of this social class, the Nepmen. So, and then you can directly refer to source 12 here. And then you need to include another point. And another point could be, for example, the scissors crisis, where we had this economic problem in Russia at the time when manufacturing goods were becoming more expensive or too expensive for peasants to buy, and agricultural production or products were becoming cheaper. And Trotsky and other Bolshevik leaders feared that the peasants, in response, would try to hoard their grain again in order to raise the price of agricultural products so that they could make more money and then buy the manufactured goods that they wanted to. the way Trotsky resolved it, if you think back, was that the Bolsheviks, or not just Trotsky, but the Bolsheviks, they put in price regulation and they set the prices of the manufactured goods and so forth so they didn't become too expensive, which put an end to the crisis itself. So that's one thing you could talk about as an effect. The other effect of the new economic policy was the positive effect in both the boost in agricultural production as well as the boost in production of various industrial products such as steel and coal and so forth, heavy industry. So there's quite a lot you can talk about here. All right. So that once you've completed question E, then you have finished your source analysis questions on the Russian Revolution. Now let us go forwards and go on to the source analysis questions for the Chinese Revolution. I'll try not to spend as much time on the Chinese Revolution, talking about the time we need to devote to each question and so forth. We'll try to zip through a little bit quicker. So let's have a look. The Chinese Revolution. So here it is here. And then I'll get the corresponding sources for the Chinese Revolution here. All right, so question A, using source 13, identify, and it's a 2-mark question. So we look again, the same structure as the Russian Revolution, the same mark allocation for the questions as appeared in the Russian Revolution, on this page anyway. So first a 2-mark question, then a 3-mark question, and then that big 9-mark question, which you can include your own historical interpretations in if you wish. So this question here, using source 13, identify 2 ways in which the Chinese Communist Party protected the Jiangxi Soviet against attacks. Okay, so you got source 13 here. It is a historian's account of the Jiangxi Soviet and so forth, the encirclement campaigns it looks like. And once again, you just list 2 direct quotes from here, okay, in source A. And this doesn't look too hard at all. Jiang Jishi's campaigns to exterminate the communist cancer in Jiangxi obliged the CCP to develop the principles of guerrilla warfare. So there's one point there. The first principle was to draw the enemy in along his supply lines until his advance units could be surrounded and cut off. The second principle was to never attack without superior numbers and assurance of success. So there's 2 tactics there. You could just refer to those 2 tactics there as your points. Okay. What else does it say? Which 2 protected the Jiangxi Soviet? Eastern Jiangxi, with its rugged hills and narrow valleys, was ideal for these tactics. The further Jiang spearheads advanced, and the more vulnerable they became. Now, the thing I should have told you about before or emphasized is that you don't include your own knowledge in here. You just have a couple of sentences here, key quotes, 2 key quotes from source 13. So, and you could have, according to source 13, 2 ways in which the Chinese Communist Party protected the Jiangxi Soviet were to draw the enemy in along his supply lines until his advance units could be surrounded and cut off. So that's your first point. And then the second point was never to attack with their superior numbers. Okay? So that is it there. If it just says list, you could just list. Okay? All right, source 14. Using source 14, describe 3 reasons why Mao Zedong thought the Long March was important. So once again, you're only using source 14. You're not using any of your own knowledge here because the question does not ask you to do that. So 3 reasons why Mao Zedong thought the Long March was important according to source 14 are or were, and then you get 3 points from here. Question C, evaluate the extent to which the decisions made by the Chinese Communist Party during the Long March contributed to its victory in 1949. Use evidence to support your response. So, once again, this is a 9-mark question, so you should spend about 15 minutes on it. Okay? You start with a very clear contention that refers to the key terms in the question here. You're evaluating, so you have to make a judgment. The Communist Party during the Long March. Evaluate the extent to which decisions made by the Communist by the Chinese Communist Party during the Long March contributed to its victory in 1949. So you could argue that. You could judge that the Long March was the key factor in the victory in 1949. You could say it was an important factor, but what was as important was what happened at Yan'an and the policies that were developed at the Yan'an Soviet, for example. Okay? There's various things you could talk about here, but you have to make a judgment. You could argue, yes, the decisions made by the Chinese Communist Party during the Long March were significant. However, perhaps the most significant factor was the leadership of Mao Zedong, both his ideas and actions. Okay? Whatever it is, though, you do make sure that you do refer to the Long March. Don't argue, or if you wish to argue the Long March isn't that significant, that's fine, but you still need to have a point or two about it. Don't just say, oh, it wasn't significant, so now I'm going to talk just about the Yan'an Soviet. Or it wasn't significant, now I'm just going to talk about Jiang Jishi's poor leadership, for example. Okay? The question is asking about the Long March, so you still have to refer to that, even if you're going to argue it wasn't as important as some other factors. So once again, you could, I argue that you should include historical interpretations in here. You must include them in the essay, but I don't see any reason why you can't include them in here as well, just to try to get those, the top marks, along with other primary source evidence and key dates. And you can as well use the sources here if you want to refer to a source here. But make sure that your big focus is you're using your own knowledge, evidence from your own knowledge, okay? All right, let us go on to the next questions here. So what do we have? And once again, lots of room to write your response here, and you should be, I remind you, writing about 250 words for this response, even up to 300 for some of you who are quick writers. All right, question D, which is a 6-marker. Using source 15 and your own knowledge, analyse 2 changes brought about by the first 5-year plan. This is probably the most difficult question in this section. What's the next one about? E, using source 16 in your own knowledge, explain the role of the Red Guards in the Cultural Revolution. Oh, that's not too bad. You can talk a lot about that. Source 15 though, let's get it up here. It's just a poster. All right, the poster below, published in 1954, titled Turn China into a Prosperous, Rich and Powerful Industrialised Socialist Country under the leadership of the Communist Party and Chairman Mao, promotes the aims of the first 5-year plan. So the question here is you have to refer to the source, and there's a lot here. You can see Mao Zedong's playing a key role, but the first 5-year plan, what is it producing? If you look at the source straight away, agricultural production beneath Mao here. So fruits and vegetables and grains, we've got wheat, as well as industrial production, as these features in the background show. Okay, so we've got a train here, we've got a dam here, it looks like. We've got steel production and building of factories and other things as well. Okay, so you can refer to those things, and obviously the key role that Mao Zedong plays in this. You would also analyse 2 changes brought about by the first 5-year plan. So agricultural production, industrial production, you refer to those features, but then you have to draw on your own knowledge. And this is a more difficult question. There's lots you can write about though. So you can talk about, for example, the 88.8% of government funding that the Communist Party devoted to the first 5-year plan for heavy industry, for improving heavy industry. And then you could talk about the 11.2% government funding that the communist government set aside for increasing or building up light industry and manufacturing and so forth. You could also talk about the other key point here, and there's your indicator there, all the fruits and so forth, if you go back to what you studied about the first 5-year plan, you could also talk about perhaps the most significant new thing that occurred during the first 5-year plan was the creation of the collectives. Okay, so they're first introduced during the first 5-year plan, these collectives. Other things you could also talk about, if you're really keen, Meisner talks about the social effects as well of the first 5-year plan, in the fact that most of the government spending occurred in the cities, and workers and managers and intellectuals gained higher wages because they worked in the factories, and as a consequence of these higher wages, their children gained better access to education and higher education than people in the countryside, than the peasants in the countryside, okay? So this is also another consequence of the first 5-year plan. So this is a difficult question, but there have been nastier questions in previous exams. Perhaps one of the most nastiest questions that I've seen in my time teaching revolutions was that infamous national minorities question on the Russian Revolution, which appeared on the 2017 exam. There tends to be, most exams are good, but every say 3 or 4 years, there tends to be a nasty exam. So just be prepared for that. And when we're talking about a nasty exam, we're talking about questions on the exam, quite obscure questions which you might find challenging. I suppose the good thing about obscure questions that you might find challenging is that other students who are also answering this exam are also going to find those questions challenging too. So what you need to do is make sure that you write as much as possible on the question. Even if you don't know that much about it, just try to do something and you'll get some marks, surely. The examiners look upon you and go, oh, you tried your best at least, and give you maybe not your 6 marks for this question, but maybe 4 marks or 3 marks. Better than writing nothing and getting no marks whatsoever. That's the worst thing you can do, so do not do that. You must answer. The cardinal rule, you must answer every question, even just a couple of points on every question, so that you can get some marks for the question rather than nothing. All right, let us now go on to question E, and that question was the role of the Red Guards, and we have to look at a source 16. Let's have a look. Oh, it's a written extract, a historical interpretation of the involvement of young people in the Red Guard movement. So there's lots you can talk about the Red Guards and the Cultural Revolution. And you have to use source 16 and your own knowledge. So you're going to get a quote from the source here, a specific quote. You're going to cite source 16 in your response here, and then you're going to include a couple of points from your own knowledge about the role that the Red Guards played in the Cultural Revolution. You could talk about their role in persecuting other CCP leaders such as Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping. You could talk about their role in destroying the Four Olds. This whole idea that they had to get rid of the old culture in order to create or make a new culture in China and create a better society. Lots of points you could use for question E here. So that pretty much brings us to the end of section A. Let us now have a look at the section B and the 2 essay questions on there. So let's have a look. We'll get on to here. And here are the questions here. So we're doing the Russian Revolution and the Chinese Revolution. It is worth 20 marks, so you should spend around 34, 35 minutes on your essay here. Okay? You could start the essay. You could begin with writing the essay. If you're really confident with your essay writing skills and you prefer to do that, you might be able to get your essay out in, say, 30 minutes, 32 minutes, and then spend more time doing Section A and the source analysis questions. That's up to you. You don't have to do it in sequential order. You can do it in what order you wish. The good thing about Section B now, in the new exam format, as I mentioned before, is that you have 2 questions here. My students, and what I teach, we do the Russian Revolution and we do the Chinese Revolution. Okay, so my students could either do the Russian Revolution or the Chinese Revolution. Now, do not get fancy. And what I mean by fancy is decide to do an essay question on a revolution that you have not studied, that your teacher has not taught you. One of my students did this once upon a time, several years ago. I think they actually did the French Revolution question, even though I had not taught them anything about the French Revolution. However, they were doing an extension subject at university, and in that extension subject, they were doing the French Revolution. So, I think that they didn't do too badly on here. They probably would have done better if they did the Russian Revolution question or a Chinese Revolution question, essay question. But you make sure you just do one of the revolutions, the essay questions on the revolutions that you did. So let's have a look. Our first question here, the Russian Revolution, it asks, in both Tsarist Russia and in the new society of the Bolsheviks, most Russian people suffered great hardships. So that's the first question. And then the Chinese Revolution question, before 1949, the people of China were subjected to policies of political and social control as a way for the Kuomintang to maintain power. And after 1949, this strategy continued under the Chinese Communist Party. To what extent do you agree? Use evidence to support your response. Now, before we go any further, I've told you you're going to spend about 34 minutes, 35 minutes answering this essay question. The other thing you need to be aware of with both of these questions, and it seems to be more of a focus now in the new study design and with the new exam format. You can even get this occurring in some of the source analysis questions, looking at change in continuity more. So both of these essay questions are looking at change in continuity. What society was like under the old regime, and then how it changed in the new regime. Okay? So, what were the people's lives in the old regime in Tsarist Russia, and then how did that change in the new Bolshevik regime, for example? And then here, it's asking about before 1949, the people of China were subjected to policies of political and social control as a way for the Kuomintang to maintain power. And then after 1949, this strategy continued under the Chinese Communist Party. So the Chinese Revolution essay question here is asking you to show your knowledge of Area of Study 1, pre-1949 China. And it's interesting here, it's only focusing on the Kuomintang, which means that you pretty much are talking about the Kuomintang in power from 1927 up to 1949. The GMD decade, 1927 up to 1937, and then the Japanese with their full-blown invasion, which starts in July 1937. The Kuomintang are still controlling some of China, so you can still talk about that as well. So, and then you also have to talk about the sort of policies of political and social control that were used by the Chinese Communist Party after 1949. Okay, so you have to talk about change in continuity. You have to use those key terms. Use those key terms and you'll get better marks. And it's the same with the Russian Revolution question in both Tsarist Russia and in the new society. So if you're talking about Tsarist Russia, you're talking about 1905 up to February 1917, that block of time. and then once the Bolsheviks get into power after October 1917, after the October 1917 revolution. So you would get marked down if you started talking about the period when the provisional government was in power here, because the question's not asking you about that. So you wouldn't talk about, for the Russian Revolution question here, the period from March 1917 up to prior to the October Revolution in October 1917. Okay? So you need to know your dates. You need to know your periods for these questions. The other thing you need to look at when you're answering these essay questions is the actual criteria. So let's have a look at the criteria itself. I'll go down, and the criteria appear at the end of the exam booklet here. So the essay in section B will be assessed against the following criteria. So this is what you have to include: construction of a coherent and relevant historical argument that addresses the specific demands of the essay question. So in your introduction for your essay, and it's just going to be your basic essay structure: introduction, 3 or 4 body paragraphs, and a conclusion. In your introduction, you must include a clear contention, which includes key terms from the essay question and answers the essay question, as well as, which is good to have as well, a summary of the key topics that you're going to talk about. So, for example, if you're talking about China, you might talk about the New Life movement under the Kuomintang, and then you might talk about the taxation policies, or you could even talk about the conscription policies. And then post-1949, there is so much to talk about the social and political controls placed upon the Chinese people. You can talk about the Cultural Revolution, you can talk about collectivization, you can talk about, the list is endless, but you're just going to have the key points that you want to talk about. You can't talk about everything. Next, demonstration of historical knowledge that is accurate and appropriate for the essay question. And just focusing here, as I just said before, there's lots you can talk about. But for example, if you're talking about the Chinese Revolution after 1949, you have to talk about the most significant events which are relevant, or factors which are relevant to the essay question. So if, for example, you're talking about social policies for China, I'll just go back to the essay question. Let's have a look at it again. Let's see. Political and social control. You have to talk about the Cultural Revolution. It is the most significant. You have to talk about that. You'd probably also have to talk about the Great Leap Forward. Okay? Then you could talk about other things. You might talk about the 100 Flowers or whatever. You can't discuss everything. You might be able to have one paragraph which refers to a number of different policies, thought control, and then refer to thought control, for example, during the thought reform campaigns, during the 100 Flowers campaign as well, and during the Cultural Revolution. You might be able to structure it in that way. But if this question here in the Chinese Revolution, post-1949, if you're talking about post-1949, if I got an essay and it didn't talk about the Cultural Revolution, I would mark it down. Just because you're not showing that historical knowledge, okay, that key event. Next, application of historical thinking concepts such as cause and consequence, continuity and change, and or historical significance. So, as I said, the big focus now is continuity and change, but you're still going to talk about cause and consequence. You can still talk about historical significance, the most historically significant event post-1949 in China is the Cultural Revolution, or is the Great Leap Forward. Cultural Revolution. And you specifically use these terms. So, for example, you can just have a question, you can have a statement along the lines of, there was continuity in the lives of the peasants prior to 1949 and post 1949 because they were impoverished, for example, and then give, refer to the Great Leap Forward, or they were still starving, can talk about the Great Leap Forward, and then you can refer to some of the famines that occurred under Zhang Jishe's rule as well. So, and then you can talk about change, but you specifically use that key term change. A key change in the lives of the intellectuals post 1949 was that they were constantly persecuted by the CCP, for example. All right, next and finally, use of sources as evidence to support a historical argument, including a range of primary sources, perspectives, and historical interpretations. So this is the other thing you must do. You must use primary sources and you must use historical interpretations. The old rule was, and it's still relevant here for an essay, if you wrote an awesome essay, but you didn't include historical interpretations, then you hit a glass ceiling and you would only get 80%. You wouldn't, to pass through that, to break through, smash that glass ceiling, you needed to include historical interpretations. And that could include just you citing, quoting an author, quoting Morris Meisner's view about the Cultural Revolution, quoting Chang and Halliday's view about, for example, Mao Zedong's motives for the 100 Flowers campaign, that he'd always set out to trap intellectuals from the beginning. So you could include these individual historical interpretations in your discussion as you're going through this essay, or you could take your discussion of historical interpretations even to the next level and start comparing and evaluating historical interpretations. So, for example, historian A. Meisner argues that the Great Leap Forward, Mao aimed to achieve this in the Great Leap Forward. In contrast, Chang and Halliday argue Mao achieved or aimed to achieve this in the Great Leap Forward, and then you could make or evaluate and make a judgment about which of these interpretations is more accurate and why, or you might say both interpretations are correct because, and then include some point there. But if you can compare and contrast historical interpretations and evaluate them, then that's an even stronger discussion of historical interpretations. And then obviously you're going to use as many primary source quotes, stats, and so forth that you can in your essay. If we're looking at the essay on China, you could refer to, use a stat that you've used, we spoke about that 88.8% government funding going to heavy industry during the first 5-year plan, for example. If you didn't use it in your first in your response for that source analysis earlier in the exam, and suddenly you remember it here, you go, all right, I'll use it in the essay. You could use, for example, estimates about the number of people who died during the Great Leap Forward. Jasper Becker estimates that 30 million people died. And while I'm speaking about this, if you're writing on the Chinese Revolution, particularly post 1949, it's very important, if you can, to cite for any statistic, particularly the death stats about how many people died during the Cultural Revolution, or who were persecuted during the 100 Flowers campaign, or who died during the Great Leap Forward. Try to include the historian's name who comes up with this estimate, just because there's the estimates can be quite different. So one historian might argue 20 million people died in the Great Leap Forward, where another historian argues 40 million people died in the Great Leap Forward, for example. All right. As well as your statistics, obviously, you're going to include quotes. You could talk about, and you're trying to include the key quotes, the famous quotes. And for example, Mao Zedong has numerous famous quotes. If you're talking about, for example, the introduction or the passing of the marriage law in 1950, you could talk about Mao's very famous quote, "Women hold up half the sky." various, quotes like that. So there's a lot you can include there. Okay, let's go back to this essay question. So I reckon that is about it. I've gone on a bit in my review of the 2022 exam. I hope you find it useful for your exam preparation, and I wish you all the best at the end of this year. Good luck, Revolution students, and goodbye.